Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
Nathan, I know that you've been very drawn into this epic rap battle between Drake and Kendrick Lamar that's escalated over the weekend. So just wanted to go ahead and put that out there. And for listeners who can't pick
Thanks
up
for your consolation
heavy
there.
sarcasm in my voice. Yes.
Well, yeah, not how I thought we were starting, but well played.
All right, just making sure you're awake and on your toes. On a serious note, let's talk about protests today. This has been a long time coming. Now, obviously, protests are in the news right now. Specifically, I think the most controversy surrounds Columbia University, but this is happening all around the nation. It's happening in my neck of the woods. UGA is making headlines, and of course, Emory University is making headlines, and now Mississippi. So we want to consider some of the specifics eventually, but it would probably be helpful if we began with some broad principles, because we had a helpful question, as we often do, from you, dear listeners, about the nature of protests and the ethics, really, of protests, and specifically, ought Christians to protest? So why don't we begin there in this territory? I'll say a few words, and then I really want to hear you weigh in, Nathan. So let's talk about really the what. So what really constitutes a protest in the first place? Why would somebody protest? So the what, why, and then what's the reason? The what, why, and reason. Not three W's, I'm sorry, but the what and the why and the reason for protesting.
Yeah, swing and a miss.
Yeah, swing and a miss. So not as catchy. So what is a protest? I think in broad terms, and Nathan, please feel free to add to this definition, but I think in broad terms, a protest is a public gathering of activists to call into question, to protest a certain piece of legislation, a decision on the part of the nation that they're a part of, or it could be something to do with a decision their community has made. But at any rate, it's a public gathering of people rallying behind a cause, and it aims to disrupt. That's part of what a protest is doing. And I think that brings us into some tense territory right away. I'll say a few words here, and then I want to kick it over to you, Nathan. Because when we think about protests, one of the anxieties surrounding protests is that they will turn violent. And indeed, a lot of people who write about protests from a sociological standpoint or a historical standpoint will say part of the power and the effectiveness of a protest is that they include the possibility of violence. They include the possibility of escalation. And just to sort of hop forward a little bit right now and talk about Columbia just for a second, just as a case in point, that if you see some of the interviews with some of the student protesters, they're using language very much along these lines. They'll say things along the lines of, well, if, police are deployed and they're very brutal in their tactics, now that's a highly debatable accusation that's being made. Plenty of people have said that the police have been very professional in their manner and that it's not brutal. But if they're saying police are being very brutal, then they better, we're going to step this up. They better expect a counter reaction. Well, that's the threat of escalation is what that is. And so if you push this in a certain direction, some critics might say not only are protests inherently violent, but there's a sort of inevitability to them that would push you in a direction of violence. And some people have a very defined violence very broadly. We've talked about this before when we talk about speech, Nathan, but I mean, some people would go so far as to say that even disrupting, any form of public disruption constitutes a type of violence. I think that's a debatable point, but some people have said that. And so in that sense, protests are intrinsically violent by their very nature. I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Here's a penny for your thoughts, Nathan.
Yeah, so let's back up. I was just trying, as you were walking us through this, to think through where protests happen and where they don't. Um,
Mm,
and in time. So when we think of historical protests or marches, or we might think civil rights, Vietnam,
mhm,
Kent State, the whole um, the era of the '60s. But let's go back farther than that and think through history and think about the history of protesting. And you don't have a whole lot. You know why? Because you just kill everybody you disagree with.
right.
Like it wasn't
Yeah.
like, well, here's room for a fifth of a percent of the population to come out and really make the minority voice well known in opposition to the
Yep.
authorities and the leadership. It just, you get you do get a few with the Roman occupation of Israel back, talking first century, well, around the turn of the first millennia there, or
Mhm,
the birth of Christ, plus or minus a couple hundred years. You do have protests there, throwing fruit and all kinds of stuff. So, I mean, there are some counterexamples, but by and large, protesting is a manifestation of a concept around individual value and freedom that is a
Yep.
uniquely Christian, Western, modern idea. And so there's a sense in which we want to recognize the uniqueness of where you can protest and live to tell about it, and where you can't. A good example of this, a couple years ago, Cameron, we were in Hong Kong. We've talked about this before. And I was talking
Mhm,
to some young ladies who had been, I think, 70 some days, who were Christians, who were on the streets
mhm,
protesting the takeover, which I think in Hong Kong, protesting is like a hobby. Um,
Sure. Yeah.
Protesting the mainland China takeover of what had been kind of a British ruled area. Um, and I said, so you have such a high percentage of the city who wants this. Will it happen? And they're like, oh no. And I was like, really? And they're like, you have no idea how effective China is at putting down protest. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
they knew, and so the Chinese
And they
government
still
doesn't
did it.
care what you, and they still did it. So they were there to make themselves known and recognize that it wasn't going to work out, and they were going to get crushed and wiped off the map. Not
Mm,
literally, not. I don't think many of them died, but there was a recognition that governments don't have to listen to protest, and authorities don't have to listen to protest. And
mhm,
historically, a lot of the protests are around the concept of colonialism and what does it mean to take over another culture or another place. That, by and large, hasn't been a question historically. It's not colonialism; it's called winning.
right.
Like your
Yes.
tribe goes in and kills everybody and takes their stuff. Next
Yep.
question. Like there wasn't a. So I just point this out to say that there is a almost Judeo Christian
Mm,
moral framework in the background of saying, A, we think the voice of all people is valuable. And B, we don't think we need to kill everybody who disagrees with us. And C, there have been times in which people have pointed out inconsistencies in the moral ethos of a country and helped make valuable changes in the midst of that. So that would be the best case scenario that I can make, I think, broadly speaking, on the broad general principles of activism and protesting, is that it is a manifestation of some of the concepts that we value as Americans that I think are rooted in some of the ideas about the value of the individual and broader ideals and ethics that come to us, I think, largely through the teaching of Christ and his value of people and this high degree in the sense of oughtness and justice and righteousness that he brings. Now, I lay
mhm,
this out in that way because then I think that gives us a measure a standard to measure against when we think about how we want to evaluate whether or not a protest is
mhm.
justified or whether or not we can participate in it or what the ethical optics of it look like. So keep that in the back of your mind as we move forward. That's my best case. One of us is going to have to do this. One of us is going to have to quote Mitch Hedberg here. You remember the Mitch
Oh,
Hedberg
do it.
quote on
Yes.
protesting?
I love it. Yep. Go for it.
I'm against protesting, but I don't know how to show it. Yep, I'm against protesting, but I don't know how to show it. Um, s- so
Yeah.
I'm trying to set up the broad principles at play here. So anything you might want to take a moment and add on to that or clarify it a little bit, Cameron?
Well, I think it's really important to reinforce what Nathan's just said there. So, and this is more than just a side note. We're coming back to this again and again, but Nathan is basically pointing out that it is a Judeo Christian framework that makes possible a kind of civil protest, because to do so, you need a certain level of peace and stability, but you also need a certain regard for human dignity
Well,
and
well,
value and
let's
worth
throw
of
the reverse
individual
example in
expression.
here. Let's throw
Yeah,
a reverse example. Let's go into Iran at a public
right.
institution and hold a
Hmm.
pro-Israel rally where you're clogging up the traffic, disrupting educational
Right.
service, and breaking things. How many days is that going to last?
Of course, you're right. And
so,
this is why
so sometimes
comparison is the
contrast is the
mother of
mother of
clarity.
clarity. Yeah. Thanks,
Yes,
Osgoodus.
yes. And that's true. And so that's really important to think. That's why, going back further in history can be such a helpful tonic for clarifying our thinking. But one item that I want to single out here, because this has to do with the why. So we're talking about the what, and now we're talking about the why. You pointed out those friends of yours who participated in the Hong Kong protests, and it's true, Nathan. We were there right before everything really escalated
Hmm.
in team meetings, so that was an interesting moment. But the fact that they were completely aware of how technically ineffective what they were doing was, so that brings to that brings to the forefront. All right, the why, the purpose. Why would they be out there doing that, at some risk when they knew it wouldn't be, quote, effective in the first place? That seems to point to some intrinsic value and worth to self expression when we are behind what we believe to be as an ethical cause. And let's just go ahead. We're going to, when we get to the specifics, we're going to do our best. Nathan and I are, this is a point of value for us. We're going to try to steel man the position of those
Sure.
who are at Columbia with whom we have serious differences. But let's just grant that most people, when they are part of a protest, if we grant good faith, they are doing so because they believe they're behind a just cause. They're trying to do what's right. And
Correct.
even and so, yeah.
Well, here's the distinction, though, Cameron, that I think comes into play here. One is the protest demanding something, or is the protest highlighting something? Now, that might sound like it's
Mm,
splitting hairs, but I think
sure.
there can be a difference when somebody is saying, "Look, what I see happening in society around me is wrong, and I'm going to make it known that I disagree." Even if it doesn't change anything. I think, and we've talked about boycotts in the past and that kind of thing. There are products and companies and things that I don't support or purchase things from,
Hmm.
and my lack of participation in their economic system has zero outcome. Like, I mean, I am a drop in the bucket and wasn't a good part of
Right.
their constituency in the first place. It has nothing to do with me trying to manipulate
Hmm.
anything about their leadership, their board, their system, what they do or don't sell. It's just for me a matter of personal conscience of saying I don't want to have anything to do with that,
Hmm.
and that's it. So it's a virtue thing, not a manipulation thing. And I think we should come back to that later, because I
We
think that
should.
might be part of the answer to how we think about the logistics of force and what's chosen freely and coercion and how change actually works. But I would say that for the Christians that I knew involved in the Hong Kong protest, um, for them it wasn't they didn't think that their action was going to change the government. They weren't demanding anything from
Right.
anybody else. They were just saying, in good conscience, we can't stand by and watch some of the things that we hold to be valuable trampled.
Right.
Um,
But
I don't.
also,
I'm not quite sure I like my answer there just yet. But
I think we can make a meaningful distinction between protests that have as their main motivation some sort of demand, and those that wish to alter or disrupt public perception on a particular issue.
oh, hang on, can I add a third caveat in here or
Yeah,
another?
please do
I don't
so.
know. I don't know why I said third. I don't know what number one. There's also a difference, Cameron, when you look at the nature of feudal protest. That you look at some of the Cultural Revolution protest in China. The guy being run over by a tank. Um, there's
Hmm.
a there's a distinction between a willingness to know you're going to be killed. So there's a distinction in a protest if the protesters are there with a willingness to suffer versus the willingness to inflict damage. Does you know what I'm saying? So if you're there thinking I'm here and I'm willing to put my body in harm's way in order to make a point, That's different than saying I'm here and I'm willing to break stuff and destroy stuff and to hurt other people in order to make my point. Perhaps that would be the classic distinction between, because we're going to have to make a distinction between protesting and rioting
Hmm.
at some point here as we go along as well. So um, they're not all created equal, particularly when
Right.
it comes to the mind of whether or not you're willing to suffer for the cause or whether or not you're just there to break stuff.
Well, and that's why it's instructive to, it's hard not to keep really returning to the civil rights movement. Well, part of what makes the civil rights movement so remarkable I mean, there are many features that make it remarkable, but the steadfast commitment to nonviolence, for one, but also their strategy was a long term strategy. I don't think most of the people who were involved were under no illusions that there was going to be a quick light switch change on any of this. And that might be, you brought up the danger of rioting and really kind of revolutionary activity, Nathan. And that might be one. Let me add on to that distinction by just saying, if you're committed to reform, that's a long, slow process that requires fierce patience and dedication and devotion. If you get to a place where you're demanding instantaneous change, then that is the way of revolution. And that does result in serious violence. And the the track record for that historically is not a good one. But I
Mhm.
think when we're considering why, some of if we can look to some of the positive examples, we'll see pictures of people who are committed to, who have a long-term strategy in mind. They recognize that this may seem to be a drop in the bucket right now, but it will make a long-term difference. That's where you think of Martin Luther King Jr. saying the arc of history bends towards justice. That's a
Mhm.
massively hopeful statement to make for
Yeah.
a man, particularly in his position. And so I think that's worth bearing in mind if we're thinking about those protests in their best instances. You see people gathered together, animated by realistic hope and a long term strategy. Sometimes they do have demands. We can be specific here. Christians do. We'll get more specific in a second, but Christians, of course, protest as well. There are abortion rallies and protests. There are protests against pornography. There are boycotts of. We've talked about Budweiser on here before. The boycott there. The boycotts of Target, for instance. Those are geared, especially if we're targeting the wallets of
Mhm.
high level people at a certain major company. That's obviously meant to make things happen and to change things. So
Yeah.
there are demands there as well. Yep.
When you're talking about, when you use the word revolution, I was reminded, when you were saying the history of it is not good. So you kind of have the famous revolutionary Simon Bolivar, South
Mm.
American, leader there. But he had a good quote that I think summarizes what you're saying. He said, "He who leads a revolution plows the sea." So you get this idea of,
Yeah.
running a plow through the ocean. It makes a wave, but it fills right back in with something else.
Hmm.
And so it's
It's a great
for
quote.
it's a
Yeah.
great quote for a revolutionary to recognize. He who leads a revolution plows the sea. There's another element at play here, though. You had quoted Martin Luther King Jr. on this, that is different between a revolution and a protest. Um, and I like your designation that there's a speed thing at play here of how fast we want to change, but there's also an ideological difference here in that, think of it this way, is that the genius of Martin Luther King Jr. is that he was appealing to the moral conscience of a nation, saying, look, if you are a Christian and you hold Christian ideals and values and you take those seriously and consistently, then you have no justification for treating somebody with a different skin color differently than yourself.
Mm.
So he was appealing to an already shared moral conscience and was asking for consistency in its application, which I think is right. And that's why it worked, because he was saying, "Hey, white people, like, think about this for a second. If you're a Christian and you believe in justice and you believe in, the basic things that are outlined to us through the scriptures, but also like all men are created equal, that's endowed by their creator. We're using very common language here to say, can we have the consistent application of the shared cultural values? and that
Hmm.
led for a very, very powerful and just reformation of our society. We're still working out all the implications and details of that, but it's got us headed in the right direction. The difference, and I would contrast it, is that what we see in a lot of the modern protest is not a shared moral vision. So you can't, so it
Mm.
doesn't work for the protesters to say, well, like, obviously you believe this is wrong, so join us in our protest, because they're actually calling for an entirely different reading of history and way of thinking about the world. And so there isn't that shared paradigm that we're trying to collectively figure out how to refine and refurbish. And to many people's taste, it's a totally different and antithetical to the things they believe type of protest, which then makes it look like a revolution. So it's the
Hmm.
lack of shared values between that which is protested against and those who are protesting that makes it a revolution rather than just a clarification isn't the right word, but a call to consistency or integrity is a different type of protest than one where you're wanting to change the whole structure and the whole reading of the reality and perspective on things. Um, can you say more to that? Because it seems to me like
That's an
that's
extremely important
baked
point
in
to
here
make.
somewhere.
Yes. Let me give you an example of it that I think is very pertinent. So let's take a massively influential coalition like the LGBTQIA plus coalition. Relatively small group, but exercises outsized cultural influence. There tends to
Hmm.
be People tend to assume this is a very unified movement. In fact, it's not at all. What unifies the LGBTQIA plus coalition is really more a sort of version of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But
Hmm.
internally, there is massive tension and division. And so just think specifically between somebody who would be gay or homosexual and somebody who would be trans. So, and I'm drawing my thinking here from Carl Truman. He looks at, I mean, a lot of people have analyzed this and pointed out this tension. He does this very well in The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. But you have two conflicting visions of sexuality here.
Hmm.
One is entirely fluid and views gender itself as a social construction. That would be the trans movement. The other, actually, this is going to sound strange, is ironically committed to a little bit more
Immutability.
of a immutability, a little bit more of a traditional view of gender. And so there's not only is there massive tension, there's actually these two worldviews are contradict one another. They're not compatible. And there is actually there's more than tension here. There's actually some very real hostility between these people. Now they've banded together and rallied behind a political cause. That is a microcosm of a lot of what you see in some of these protest movements, necessarily
Hmm.
so because they're underwritten by such a fiercely individualistic and narrow understanding of personhood to begin with that it makes a large commitment to some sort of a common good almost impossible. And the other
Well,
voice, yes,
hang on.
go
Can
ahead.
we just clarify your point here a second? Which is why I
Hmm.
think even your old school liberals are like, what in the world does a student at Columbia and Hamas have in common?
Right. Yeah.
Like nothing on human values, sexuality, freedom, structure of
Hmm.
government, of belief, like none of it. So that's what's blowing people's minds. Like, how do you form a coalition of anyway?
Well,
So,
let's talk some specifics then, Nathan, to give context here, just in case some of our listeners haven't been burrowing into the fine print of these stories. What are the specific demands? Let's look at Columbia right now, because Columbia is
mhm,
sort of being singled out as the poster child of all of this, even though they're by no means the only university where this is taking place. But their specific demands, obviously, they have to do with, people know broadly this has to do with the war between Israel and Hamas, but their demands, and they have demands. They're demanding immediate changes to the financial practices of Columbia University, which are admittedly very nebulous to begin with. But Nathan,
sure.
clue us in a little bit on what specifically the most articulate of these students want to happen or want Columbia to stop doing.
Yeah, so to the degree that it's fully understood by, and I think there is some diversity within it. some people look at it as a pro-Palestine, others look at it as an anti-Israel. But the main things that they're chanting for, or the signs that you see, follow a category of protests called BDS, which is boycott, divest, sanction. So
Mm.
boycott, divest, sanction. And a lot of this year's right now, the conversation is around divestment. So, these colleges and universities have massive endowments often. So you're talking millions, if not billions of dollars of invested assets. And the argument is going for the students at Columbia is saying, look, we're complicit in the destruction of what's happening in Palestine. Because we support not only things like exchange students from Israel and Israeli professors, but more importantly to them, that some of the money of Columbia's investments is invested in weapons manufacturers and other types of organizations that are financially benefiting from the war between Hamas and Israel. So there's that. Then, if you look at their list, it's also like divest from Airbnb, because Airbnb lists houses in the West Bank, divest from the equipment manufacturer Caterpillar, because Caterpillar bulldozers
Mhm.
are used as part of this. So also Google and Amazon are now on the list of companies they want Columbia to divest from, which is interesting. I don't know if they're consistently, as protesters, divesting from Google and Amazon in their personal lives, but of saying these are companies
I
who are
doubt
making
it.
money off of this
Yeah.
conflict. So the idea
Mhm.
is that you withdraw your fiscal support and you refuse to financially benefit from things that you think are unethical. Now, I'm
Mhm.
sympathetic, not in this case to that specific set of things, but I said earlier that I do that on a small level myself of like, I don't want to have anything to do with this company. And I'm imagining that almost everyone here listening to this podcast also has companies that are like, no, um, I'm not wearing their apparel or anything else out of a principled reason. So that's the thing behind it.
Mhm.
Now, let's talk about the practicality of this for a little bit, because if you look at the element of what colleges and universities own of the investment options that are based on this, you're looking at something perhaps around um, so total higher education ownership of the stock market, for example, is about 0.1%. So we're talking about
Mhm.
a tenth of a percent is owned by colleges and universities. And then of that tenth of a percent, the percentage that is um, invested in things that are tied up in Israel is very nebulous to figure out what is and what isn't there. And a little bit of the motivating factor, Colombia keeps going back to like, well, in the 60s, we protested apartheid South Africa and that fell apart. But there have been multiple academic studies during that time that saying protests calling for economic shifts in foreign government policies have no real results, that they actually don't do anything. And in fact, then there's a whole counter argument saying that if you have a group that believes that they are ethical investors who are then called to forfeit their shares in a company, they sell those shares and they're bought by people who really don't give a rip. You haven't
Mhm.
changed
Sure.
the economic structure of that interaction. So let's say that Colombia did own 10% of a weapons manufacturer, which they don't. It's not even close to anything like that. And they sold those shares, somebody else would buy them, and that weapons manufacturer would just keep right on trucking. So this is one where, given the fact that there's so much evidence that even if the demands were met, that it would manifest no legitimate change, that makes it harder to justify. Um, so hold that in the back of your mind, and the fact that it's a very pessimistic, narrow framework in which we think that economic manipulation is the best form of change. So back to the civil rights movement. There were economic things there, like okay, black people aren't going to use the bus system, like that
Mhm.
mattered, but it was way secondary to the moral issues that were at play there. And so the call to consistency to moral action on the collective consciousness of a nation is what brought about the change, not about a bus company in some state that most people who are involved in this
Right.
didn't live in. So that's where a little bit of the pessimism, I think, or the openness to critique can come in, is to say, even if you were entirely successful, does it make a difference? And if it doesn't, then are you not better off arguing from a moral category rather than a fiscal or a financial one? Um, I think those are questions that we should be asking when we're thinking about protesting from a Christian perspective, and ones that open different forms of agitation up to criticism of thinking through what is it that you're really asking for, and what's your real motivation here, and then what are you personally willing to risk and put on the line. And that has been a large part of the critique of some of this, is saying, look, here the difference is you have students who don't want to talk to the press by and large, who are covering their faces. They don't want to be personally implicated in this. um, that's a different form of protest too than somebody saying, I'm really willing to put my reputation, my future, my
Mm-hmm.
job prospects, whatever, on the line.
Right.
um, this is a different kind of a thing than that. So I got off topic there a little bit, but more fuel for the flames.
No, and I think probably a great question always is, what does success look like for a movement? It's a very important question to ask oneself. Here, in these cases, there are very clear demands, but as you pointed out, Nathan, it's not at all clear. In fact, what does seem to be clear is that even if such demands were met, it would not make much of a tangible difference. Just to steel man it for a second, because we do try to do that. I've seen some. Now let's be fair. We've seen some protesters interviewed who have no idea what's going on. It's worth pointing that out. That's why there's a reason for a good deal of the skepticism and the cynicism concerning some of these movements, because there are plenty of people who honestly are just, there's the thrill and the excitement and the exhilaration of being part of a big cause and a movement. And you're young, and many of these protesters, it's safe to say, are almost entirely innocent of any understanding of history on these matters. So that's real. And that's not a slander. That's just a salient factor to bring up. But some of them are. And the more articulate protesters I've seen will say things along the lines of, look, this might look bad right now, but 20 years in the future, 30 years, 40 years, people will see that we were on the right side of history on this one. And so, in other words, we're
right,
confident
because blocking Jewish students based on their race from going to class has that one's aged well.
Yes, right, and of course, and so the other big, the big elephant in the room, which we need to mention, we haven't mentioned yet, we've talked about it before on the podcast, is the anti-Semitism that's animating so much of this. Now, there's a good deal of resistance to that, of course, that people will say, "Oh, no, we're not. We're anti-Zionist. We're not anti-Semitic." Now, I do think we need to be careful, Nathan. I'm just going to say this: it's possible to, and you and I would both say it's possible to call into question some of the tactics that Israel's military force deploys, for instance, without being anti-Semitic or anti-Israel. We've got to state that clearly.
Crucial that we make that distinction. Yeah, I think that the slippery tendency, we can say on one hand, the protesters in these cases are muddling history. Christians need to be careful not to do the same thing and confuse their theological concept of Israel with the modern nation state, and therefore act like anything that the modern state of Israel does has a blank check from God to do whatever. There's no theological, socio-political, whatever reason for conflating those two in that way. And so we want to be very, very careful to make the distinction that we're asking other people to make as Christians as we think through this. I think, just by and large, probably what's happening there is that a lot of people are putting theological language on a political perspective, which is from an American perspective of who would you rather have as an ally in the Middle East, Israel or Gaza? And they're just making the choice there of which one is best for the country, and then adding some theological bumper stickers to it along the way. Mm-hmm. So yeah, let's be consistent across the conversation here. However, whatever side you're falling out on, yeah, thanks for making that distinction. I think it's important.
And I think we need to kind of wend our way toward some kind of a pausing point here for at least this episode. I think we'll come back to this, but when we're thinking about the purpose or the reason behind protests and what we hope to achieve, it seems to me that a good way to look at this, if we're thinking about, hey, we're Christians, what does an ethical or what does a Christian protest look like? Maybe the hope isn't centered so much on a set of immediate demands. Maybe it's more centered on trying to change public perception. Now, this is a more powerful way to try to change public perception, and it
Mhm.
does involve some disruptive tactics. That's true. It includes, I think, necessarily some threat of violence. I think in most cases it does. If you stage a public protest, even the civil rights movement, there were eruptions of violence. Now those, the civil rights protesters were firmly committed to no physically violent retaliation, but violence did erupt because this was a hugely volatile issue, and so that often is the case. So
Mhm.
I think that's an inherent risk. I think that's a conservative way to say it. I think we could at least say that. But I think the goal, it seems to me, and this is just Cameron McAllister speaking, so you can take it with a grain of salt, the goal ought to be more about persuasion. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be manipulative. There are certain issues that are so deeply entrenched, that are so harmful, that it can justify, I mean, that public protests are justified. But the goal, I think, rather than an immediate set of demands, because if you're going in the immediate, if you're any kind of immediacy language, anything that tries to fast track, I think starts to put you in a revolutionary kind of framework, and that's dangerous. Also dangerous, not just because it carries the threat of very serious violence, but dangerous also in the sense that it may be counterproductive. It's very easy to tear stuff apart. It's really hard to rebuild. It's really hard to make
Mhm.
stuff. And so if you want to go the way of changing public perception and you want to go the road of reform, it's slower, it requires more patience, and it requires a holy commitment to peace. And I think that's about as much as I can say.
Well, here, let me add to that, because it
Yes, please
seems like a
do.
tautology. It seems logical to assume that any idea that gains cultural prominence through violence will require violence in order to keep that idea in power. And so you get what you pay for when it comes to a revolution, and the long-term impacts and aftermath on a culture. And so I think that's why Martin Luther King Jr. is celebrated and won and Malcolm X didn't. Is
Right.
because there was peace paid for, and violence will always require violence in order to maintain that peace. And that has to be a principle that Christians should keep in the back of their mind. I think another thing here, Cameron, that, if I had a worry in the back of my mind about all of this, or a curiosity, it's to say, why is it? And in these protests, you have a high degree of organization and professional activism, and there's a lot of money thrown at these things, from paid personnel to all sorts of interesting forms of funding. But why is it that if
Mhm.
if you had a lot of money and you said, um, where am I most likely to find people gullible enough to go along with me on this type of protest, that you could go to some of our best universities and find that, and it would be the campuses that would be the least likely to be prepared to have a logical response to it.
Mm.
So there's a unique vulnerability that I see at play in,
Yeah.
like, where can we find gullible people who will carry signs chanting things that they don't know what they mean? Oh, let's go to the universities. That's where we'll find our people. We want to flip that around real quick and say, I think if you're interested in activism and protesting from a Christian perspective, you have to be really, really well informed and be very,
Mhm.
very clear that you are not being weaponized by some other group or political entity. Or this happens time and time again throughout the history of the church, in which the best intentions of Christian people are weaponized for political means and ends by other groups and people. So you just got to ask, whose tool am I really in this system? And am I outraged for the right reasons?
Mhm.
So be careful there. Be very, very well informed. I think there's a tension here of, Paul's encouragement in Timothy to, make it your ambition to live quiet, peaceful lives, working with your hands, that you have something in order to share, combined with the time in which Jesus did very much stand up on behalf of the disenfranchised, the poor, the weak, the innocent, those looked upon, those who are about to be stoned, fill in the blank. He was willing to insert himself into that situation, but, and here's the Christian version of it, always in a way in which he was the one who was willing to do the suffering, not cause the suffering. And to me, that seems to be the fundamental distinction when we think about Christian activism and protesting, of people saying, I'm willing to suffer because I believe something is right, not I'm willing to inflict harm because I think something is wrong. I think those are clear, distinct
Mm.
things in the back of our minds. And we have to be asking the question, why are we doing this? For whose sake? do we really care? And this is where I think there's some more criticism here of some of the modern protests. Why is it this issue? Why is it not Ukraine? Why is it not Yemen? Why is it not? You can go down. Why is it not Haiti? For crying out loud, that would be a phenomenal place to be doing a whole lot of protesting and raising awareness about an entire nation that's just on fire right now, almost literally. Why? So why do we care about as protesters? Why this and not this? That's one you have to wrestle with. What's the real motivation there? And if we're not consistent in our brokenheartedness for the world and our willingness to put ourselves in the places of suffering or to sympathize with those who are suffering, then suddenly it sort of makes the protest seem like it's about us and about us signaling our virtue, and us just doing what's popular at the time for our own clicks and likes, and or maybe even our own bloodlust and entertainment value of opportunities to live in little forms of anarchy from time to time. So I'm sure we hope, I don't know if we muddied the waters more, but we just wanted to slow down here a little bit and look through some of the complexities and try to give an honest look at both sides of this. You can make a steel man out of something and still melt the steel man down at the end of the day. But I think when we do
Well
that,
said.
it's more instructive for ourselves about what we don't want to be caught up in, and how we want to think about how we use our lives, energy, time, money, resources, etc., and making a change in the world. I'll leave you with where I'm stuck on this, Cameron, and then I'll let you wrap this up. Is that when I look back at my family's history, Rittenhouses came to America in the 1680s, and were right off the bat part of a group who had a written statement saying, "You cannot be a Christian and own another human." It doesn't even make any sense. There's no way you can be saved and own another human. That was, a good 180 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. However, there's one thing to make a statement like that and to not own slaves and to decry it and to denounce it. But it's still, a lot of people lived and died in the system of slavery for the next 180 years while there were people who believed that. And so how you live out, and I think this is where people can push back on what we're saying here today. How do you live out the need for, there are times in which things need to change quickly. What is the acceptable rate of change? How does it really work? What does history teach us?
Sure.
What does Christ call us to? I don't want to make it sound like I think these are overly simplistic questions, but I think there's some wisdom in taking them apart for a little bit and looking at the gears behind the face of the clock here. And so I'm not totally satisfied that I have a clean cut answer to the question as the listener wrote it to us, but I think there are some basic principles that give us some good guidelines as we move forward.
Yeah, and I think that's about the best we could do on a podcast episode, is try to outline what we take to be some good principles that can guide a moral approach to protests, and that can help us also think about it Christianly. I'm confident we only scratched the surface. I'm also confident we've got some blunders in here. We have to be able to be wrong, of course, as well. We're trying to think out loud and responsibly, but yeah, this is part of the dynamics of being a human being, and this is part of the risk of thinking as well, and thinking about contemporary issues that are happening right now and unfolding right now as we speak. Above all, I think we want to approach these matters prayerfully. I've been saying prayerfully, but I've been saying this more and more. As Christians, we want to have our views shaped not by necessarily the news, not by the most up to date
Not
perspective,
reactionary,
but really
not reactionary views.
right, not reactionary. We want to be shaped by Christ, His Word, and His people. That needs to be our fundamental orientation as we approach engagement with the wider world. So that's about as much as I can say here by way of wrapping it up. I think we'll come back to this. I think these stories are very much, unfolding as we go. They're developing stories. We'll see more. It's interesting to watch. Sometimes it's a little disheartening to watch, but we hope we've at least gotten the wheels turning here. But thank you so much for tuning in. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, Whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.